Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Donna Giver Johnston, and I have the honor and joy of serving as the pastor of Community Presbyterian Church of Ben Avon. On behalf of the church, I welcome you here tonight for the opening of our speaker series. Over the last year, our church has begun the hard but necessary work in becoming an anti-racist church, in keeping with the teachings of Christ. We have partnered with Triumph Church to build trusting relationships and have engaged the community in anti-racist work by forming a community alliance on racial equity. What began as a simple idea for Black History Month has blossomed into a more worthy goal of amplifying and celebrating Black African American history and stories and accomplishments every month. Our theme is Lost Lessons and Hidden History. We aim to give speakers free rein within that framework to talk about whatever issue or event or person or idea that they believe has not been widely taught or understood or appreciated or even celebrated. So thank you so much, Mr. Tony Norman, for your willingness to lend your perspective and your voice here tonight. I wanted to announce that next month, as you can see on your screen, April 22nd at 7 o'clock, we will have Tim Stevens, who is the CEO of the Black Political Empowerment Project. And we hope you'll join us next month for that. And we'll continue this each and every month. And just as a reminder, as you can see on your screen, to minimize disruptions and out of respect for our speaker, please stay muted and leave your video off. You can enter your questions in the Zoom chat, and we will have a Q&A at the end after Tony is done speaking. So now I will ask Community Church member Steve Mellon to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Welcome.
Thanks, Tony, or thanks, Donna. I've been a colleague of Tony's for a quarter of a century, and one of the most impressive things that I can say about him is that he has survived 30 years, more than 30 years at the Post-Gazette. And that's a testament to his resiliency and his toughness. But Tony's journey into journalism is a fascinating one, and it's unique. He started out at the Post-Gazette as a news clerk more than 3 decades ago. And in that role, he convinced the editors to let him write about pop music after his shift was over. And after a while, the editors there were wise enough to recognize his talent. And soon he became the newspaper's pop music and pop culture critic. You guys may remember, those of you who've been around for a while might remember him in that role. In 1996, he convinced the editors there to make him a general interest newspaper columnist. And that's probably how most of you know Tony, through his columns. They're consistently one of the most read and discussed items published by the Post-Gazette. And he's won more national, regional, and local awards for that column than we could possibly list here. He's also the paper's book editor. I think that's still the case, isn't it, Tony?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Unless you know something I don't, Steve.
I know nothing you don't, Tony. And you know, for years, he served on the newspaper's editorial board, which back then at least was considered the beating heart of the newspaper. It was a very considered a very important role there in shaping the newspaper's opinions on official opinions on things. And I'm sure he can tell you a story about that at some point. I've had the privilege of working with Tony on a couple of projects at the Post-Gazette the past few years, and it's like taking a master class in using words with precision and crafting tight, powerful sentences. You guys know Tony as someone with strong opinions, those that are expressed in his column. But as I've worked with him in the field, I've watched Tony engage with others who often disagree with him, and quite often very strongly. And Tony, he doesn't get defensive, he listens, and he strives to always see the world through the eyes of others, even if that worldview differs dramatically from his. And I consider that courageously empathetic. Oh, and he's currently serving as president of the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. I do not want to leave that out, Tony. So, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Norman.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks, Pastor Donna. And I want to thank all the good people there at Community Church of Ben Avon or Ben Avon, depending on how you pronounce it, for inviting me to be here to kick off this inaugural the series, exploring anti-racism. And I hope that I'm able to give this series a good start. And so, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. In November or December 1994, the Whitney Museum in New York hosted an exhibit called Black Male Representations of Masculinity in Contemporary American Art. It was a really hot ticket, and everyone wanted to see this show. It wasn't the kind of exhibition that museums the stature of Whitney typically showcased. I was in my early 30s at the time, and I had never seen a show with that kind of racial specificity in what was typically considered to be among the whitest of white spaces in the art world. By way of comparison, previous shows at the Whitney, the MoMA, and the Guggenheim that even bothered to acknowledge Black folks existed would have featured art looted from lost African kingdoms. Maybe there might have been a Jacob Lawrence or Jean-Michel Basquiat retrospective before then, but I kind of doubt it. So I scored a ticket to the Black Male show from the museum's publicist and got my ass to New York. And when I got to the show, I was decked out in my finest faux revolutionary Black Panther attire. It was a black beret to cover the depressing onset of male pattern baldness. And I had a black leather jacket. And I walked around the show, which covered a considerable amount of space at the Whitney, which surprised me. And it was certainly a big show in scope, but not a particularly good show. It felt like a strange melange of high art, middlebrow kitsch, and pop culture bric-a-brac. And I wasn't very impressed. So I descended into a bad mood pretty early on. But I was determined to spend the entire day there just soaking it in and taking in as much as I could. And I was annoyed that the place was full of white folks with no Black people in sight. But given the less than stellar nature of the show, I thought that was just as well. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted another Black man in one of the galleries. He was standing in front of a large photograph of a Black boy with a gun. The white woman who was with him was doing all of the talking. He looked familiar, so I moved in for a closer look. He kept shaking his head, agreeing enthusiastically with everything the woman said. He turned out to be a fairly established painter I knew from Philadelphia. So let's just call him James. I called out his name and we embraced like old friends, even though I could barely stand him back in Philly. He was an older dude in his late 40s or early 50s at the time. And he was arguably the most bohemian Black guy I knew in my teenage years. But we weren't particularly close, though we clocked a lot of good discussions over the years. He introduced me to his girlfriend. I didn't recognize her, but she was definitely his type. Another very pale white woman with long brown hair, rocking and emaciated. I haven't eaten in 3 days, ain't I pretty look. I honestly don't remember her name because I would use it if I did. So after a few introductory pleasantries, the conversation turned to the show. I had been scribbling my impressions in my reporter's pad for hours, so I kind of knew where I stood on the show, but I wanted to be charitable. It's all right, I said. I really liked some of it, but there's not a whole lot of coherence here. What is this show supposed to say? Since James asked the question, I was addressing my answer to him. His girlfriend, and let's call her Karen, took it upon herself to answer for the both of them. It's obvious that you don't understand how the image of the Black male has transmorgified through history, she said, or something to that effect. The word transmorgified was in the sentence. While Karen was talking, I was watching James get increasingly uncomfortable as she proceeded to lecture me about the Black experience and what I needed to learn. It turns out she had a PhD in something Black, which explained why James looked more like one of her fashion accessories than an independent human being. When I'm nervous or angry, I start smiling. So I was showing all of my teeth at that point. And instead of looking at Karen, I looked at James and responded to her through him. I refused to look at her. I wanted to punish her presumptuousness by ignoring her challenge to my Blackness. I also wanted to punish James's craven passivity in the face of such provocation at a show called The Black Male. After making an excuse to get away from them to resume my browsing in peace, Karen asked what I did for a living. When I told her I was a pop music critic in Pittsburgh, she threw her hands in the air as if to say, "Why am I even talking to this lightweight?" That put me in a pretty bad mood for the rest of the show. I kept coming up with witty rejoinders in my head after the fact, but it was too late to use them. I saw them a few more times while crisscrossing the galleries, but we did not chat and we avoided eye contact. She continued lecturing James and explaining to an established Black painter from Philly what other Black painters and artists said about their own experience over the centuries. I was incensed. It was 1994. It's a good thing social media didn't exist. If it did, I would have written a pretty angry blog post about that experience. I would have hit her with every charge from cultural appropriation to gross condescension, white-splaining, and her all-around Karen-ness. In my immaturity and hot-headedness, I might have even tried to get her canceled. Instead of mounting a counterattack on her reputation, I settled on one more direct and satisfying verdict. Karen was an asshole. End of story. We didn't get along. Move on. Race was a subtext to the encounter, obviously, but Karen wasn't racist. She seemed to spend all of her free time thinking about Black people in an academic way. She came off as a bit colonial in her attitude as far as I was concerned, but she was disappointed that I didn't love the show as much as she did. She was deeply moved by everything. "This show was curated by a Black woman, you know," she said at one point. I said rather glibly that that was probably a big part of the problem. I said that Black men who weren't on her payroll should have had some input early on. I think the cleverest thing I said during the original exchange is that I felt objectified by the show, but not represented or understood. Man, she let me have it. Now, if I'm honest, Karen could have brought me up on charges of cultural insensitivity too. At one point, I mocked a piece that prominently featured the N-word by repeating it in some gratuitous fashion. It clearly offended her that I kept saying the word. So I kept saying it, just to needle her. Because I was an idiot at the time, I said something vaguely homophobic about one of the pieces, and she called me on it, which probably explains why I got so angry so quickly as the conversation progressed or regressed. I also refused to make eye contact with her as I laughed at her points, so I was definitely negating her personhood. I wasn't giving her the respect she deserved as an interlocutor. I was being sexist and perhaps even a little bit racist. I was treating her like a non-entity because I felt she had insulted my racial integrity by daring to lecture me about Blackness when she was a skinny, hippie-ish white woman. So if social media of the kind that exists today had existed then, she might very well have tried to assemble a Twitter mob to cancel me. And she would have called me a self-hating, bourgeois, sexist, homophobic, Black conservative. And I'm none of those things. I also wasn't conversant with any of the notions of critical race theory she was throwing at me. I felt insecure about the fact she obviously knew more about Black history than I did and could name drop the names of Black artists faster than I could. By 2021 standards, both Karen and I would have been canceled, depending on who pulled their bullhorn out first. Had we taken our grievances to our respective bubbles, it would have been ugly. By the standards of 1994, we were both assholes who met, didn't make a good first impression in either direction, and moved on. No one's job was threatened, and both of us were smart enough to realize at the end of the day that what happened between us was no big deal. I never saw her or James again, though they both continue to live on in my retelling of the tale. Though life was exceptionally complex even then, there were no larger racial political implications beyond the hurt feelings generated on both sides. Today, every word said that day will be scrutinized for subtext, intention, state of mind, implicit bias, and dog whistling. We were both bad actors. We were both being jerks at the first sight at the Whitney Museum. Whenever I think back to that day, I just laugh. And I'm just grateful that no lawyers had to be consulted in the shaping of this anecdote. This is not 1994, and the nature of discourse has changed dramatically in 27 years. It would be naive to say, hey, let's pretend it's the 90s again and just give people the space to be idiots in interpersonal encounters, not explicitly intended to be racist. That isn't practical because the last year has opened the eyes of millions of white Americans to the corrosive hegemony of white supremacy. The murder of George Floyd created a sea change in the nation's understanding of the place of systemic racism in every institution of American life. White supremacy is the lingua franca of American identity and the grand unifying theory of American life. It permeates everything from economics to education, to who gets vaccinated first during a pandemic, to the paucity of grocery stores in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. It is the ghost in the machine of American life. White supremacy corrupts everything, and it isn't a one-way street where all powerful white folks forever hold the keys to the personhood and validation of non-whites. White folks have to struggle with the same legacy of dehumanization in this country that Black, brown, beige, and the entire spectrum of non-whites and poor whites here have to deal with for centuries, had to deal with for centuries. The country was established in blood, discrimination, displacement, slavery, genocide, and the pursuit of happiness for a few, and the infliction of violence on the many by militarized police, if it should come to that. That's just the painful, indisputable fact of the matter. Yet it was disputed by the majority of white folks until last year. Watching Officer Derek Chauvin put his full body weight on George Floyd's neck while seeming to jiggle change in his pockets broke the last credible bastion of denial for those who formerly thought of their victims, who thought other victims of fatal police brutality brought it on themselves somehow. America was already slowly moving in that direction. But the video of a malicious white cop murdering a handcuffed Black man begging for his mother as he gasped for air took away every excuse. It left white folks who were formerly indifferent with a stark choice. Either Black folks were human or they weren't of any consequence at all. You either had to see Chauvin's act of murder as justified, or you had to join millions of Americans in the street protests during a pandemic, or educate yourself about this country's history of racial violence by reading anti-racist literature during lockdown. Suddenly, the best-selling books in America were about anti-racism, Black-white allyship, and forgotten or unknown parts of African-American history. The landscape of American political opinion had a hard time keeping up with the changing reality as it continued to fixate on the daily disruptions of Donald Trump. Even as Americans began to look at our history more holistically, the right wing began going nuts. The mockery of wokeness became the singular occupation of those desperately trying to maintain the status quo of white privilege. Trump nursed what he hoped would be a sufficiently hot culture war to help sweep him into a second term, but it fell short. His only consolation was that he radicalized enough white folks to reject reason and progress altogether and join a Trump-worshiping cult called QAnon. In doing so, he effectively destroyed the integrity of the Republican Party, but that's a story for another day. This talk is titled, How to Be a White Ally and a Good Black Friend, a modest proposal for uncanceled times. The title is meant to be only half facetious because it implies an answer that is prescriptive and easy to apply. Alas, I'm destined to be the latest in a long line of magic Negroes to fail you. There's never an easy way to deal with the misunderstanding that inevitably creeps into the interpersonal relationships of humans. But there is a way to reframe them so that you're not assuming the worst of those who have chosen to be your allies in the battle against white supremacy. How to be a white ally. Understanding that white supremacy is not a theoretical model concocted by disgruntled Black academics and BLM leaders is non-negotiable. If you harbor any doubt that white supremacy is real, then you'll have to settle for a very superficial relationship with non-whites who know better. White supremacy is a very real worldview, and it permeates everything. You don't even have to be conscious of it, but it sure is conscious of you. 2, approach allyship with a spirit of adventure and open inquiry. Bring your whole heart and mind to the relationship, and don't fear the fact that those you once thought of as other seem mysterious or aloof and suspicious of your motives. Black folks don't like being thought of as exotic or used as a mission field for nascent white liberal guilt. Being friends with anyone is hard. Crossing the racial barriers to be friends is even harder because white supremacy has made it so since 1619, when nearly 24 enslaved Africans were deposited on a beach in Virginia against their will. Black folks become skittish whenever we see smiling white folks walking too quickly in our direction. So just give it time. 3, accept the fact that misunderstandings during this period of educating oneself about structural and systemic racism is inevitable, and roll with it. Of course, you never heard of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre or 99% of the other atrocities that have happened to Black folks and Native Americans and Asian immigrants over the centuries. The American education system was constructed in a way to make you obedient workers lacking the critical acumen to interrogate national myths. The official American narratives lacked the terror and horror that would indict white supremacy, so that the esteem of white folks is never adversely affected by what they learn. Prior to George Floyd, it never occurred to millions of white folks to wonder why American history taught in school was so lopsided, with only a chapter devoted to Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, after half a chapter on Lincoln and the Civil War. The assumption was that other than slavery, minstrel shows, jazz, boxing, and Rosa Parks, Black folks just didn't contribute much to America or American history. White folks are paying catch up big time right now. So certain questions and assumptions seem simple-minded to Black folks who got prior glimpses of this reality the hard way. Still, have no doubt that most Black folks found out about the Tulsa massacre the same way most white folks did last year, by watching the first episode of the Watchmen series on HBO. Blacks are not in possession of a unified history of how we got here and what we've endured. Black folks get annoyed when it is assumed that we do. 4, humility, not fear, is the key to a productive relationship across the color line. If you're afraid to say what you think because it might cause a non-white person to get angry with you, then you're guilty of othering that person, and you're not ready for a friendship that is guaranteed to challenge your comfort level. Black folks really aren't interested in allies, strictly speaking. They're more interested in cultivating actual friends willing to share their hopes and dreams as equals, and not as missionaries sent from white America to proselytize the heathen. 5, white supremacy is so pervasive that it will take several generations to fully understand the ramifications of such a belief system on all of American life and history. When the steel industry collapsed in Western Pennsylvania in the 80s, the air quality didn't immediately get better, but it did gradually improve to the point where it was possible to brag about how much cleaner it had become, despite the presence of fine particulate matter that still makes our air among the least healthy in the country. Think of your own lingering racist ideas as the fine particulate matter we're all trying to scrub out of our system. As long as we don't continue to put smoke in the air, we'll get to a better place eventually. Now, how to be a good Black friend. 1, let's be honest. The hardest thing for any Black person to be is a good Black friend. Whether earnestly anti-racist in their views or unrepentant racists who claim the colored people they grew up with in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were their best friends, it was never possible to be friends with white folks without worrying about potential deadly consequences until the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were signed into law in the mid-1960s. Even after Jim Crow was retired, you still had to watch them white folks like a hawk, as my late grandma used to say after difficult days at work. But it would be intellectually and morally dishonest not to acknowledge the massive changes that have taken place in American society, especially in recent years. There is now a growing understanding of the perniciousness of white supremacy and how it has impacted everything. Yes, the system is still rigged against meaningful friendships across the color line, but it is possible and it should be desirable. If you're open to such friendships, you're not being an Uncle Tom or an auntie. You're being a fully actualized human being capable of making distinctions between good people and bad people based on the way they treat you. 2, you're not obligated to talk about race with your white friends if you don't want to talk about it. You don't have to serve the function of absolving them of sin or spreading a redemptive salve over their guilty white consciences. If you're truly friends first and allies 9 or 10 on a list of 10, then that's ideal. When the subject of white supremacy does come up, it will be easy to deal with any misconceptions, as far as you're concerned, from a position of real caring about your friend's understanding of America and the world. Don't give in to the temptation of being the final authority on race matters just because you're Black. Yes, you're Black. You have a lifetime of experiences that give you an edge in understanding what that means, but that hardly makes you an authority. You're a friend who might be able to bring some added perspective to the situation. You are not John the Black Baptist heralding a gospel of interracial understanding. You're a sinner too, because you've been affected by white supremacy just as much as your white friend, but in massively different ways. Remember that being Black has never meant that you have all the answers. Black people don't even have all of the questions. Recognizing our mutual cluelessness is a big step towards recognizing our mutual humanity. 3, suffering while Black doesn't mean you're morally superior on any level. It just means you can draw from a deeper wellspring of experiences in America. Being Black means you can either create jazz or become a junkie in response to the pain inflicted on you by white supremacy. This is not essentialism. This is common sense. Black folks have to play 3- and 4-dimensional chess, even before there was a word for it. The opportunity for deeper friendships and allyship across the racial divide presents an unprecedented opportunity in American history. Don't be cynical. Every act of Black genius is a survival mechanism first before it becomes an innovation in whatever field it takes place with it. It's the blues, and the blues are eternal. 4, in making friends across the racial divide, it helps to forget about artificial constructs like Black and white people, as if anyone is reducible to such a crude shorthand. As your friendships deepen, this will become increasingly the case because goodwill is reciprocal. 5, as a Black person, you already know that it is not advisable to become friends with someone who thinks you can magically enlighten them. You should only become friends with those who can enlighten you and expand your sense of possibilities about the world. This means you should also be honest with your friend who happens to be white. Tell them when they're messing up and undermining your friendship by holding on to racist ideas despite being corrected. If they subscribe to destructive politics or worldview you consider antithetical to a thriving friendship built on mutual trust and integrity, gently ghost that person until they come to their senses. Don't walk on eggshells for anyone. Tell the truth. In many ways, these modest proposals to Black and white people are arbitrarily ordered and numbered here. I could come up with a completely different list tomorrow and make it a hell of a lot more earnest or more ridiculous. But I want to keep this relatively light and thoughtful. In my humble opinion, all anti-racism education boils down to one thing: recognizing the ubiquity of white supremacy and how it ruins everything. It is also a way of acknowledging that our history is not binary. There are more players on the field than just Black and white folks. And until we get this simple fact internalized, we're doomed to oppress others while huddling in a defensive crouch. Being anti-racist is a way of traveling through the world productively and guilt-free. And that's what we should all be striving for. It truly is a countercultural ethic to the philosophy that currently governs America. It fills in the blanks of our understanding and makes sense of American history in ways the myths we're encouraged to believe don't come close to doing. Even if my advice is taken as gospel, it doesn't mean there won't be misunderstandings and hurt feelings. Lots of folks have become addicted to feeling aggrieved and slighted when there's no reason to feel that way. There's something about our social media environment that encourages folks to join a virtual lynch mob at the first opportunity. Sometimes the person getting ratioed or canceled is a truly horrible person who did something beyond the pale. But more often than not, it's someone who doesn't understand how his or her perception of the world has been refracted through a prism of white supremacy or patriarchy, or even just old-fashioned racism. Folks are just learning the rules of the road, but they're often being held to a higher standard that lacked consensus just a year or two ago. In some ways, the possibility of being canceled is an indirect sign of progress. If we were still ensconced in a world where so many white folks didn't care as much about social justice or being perceived as racist, being canceled would be impossible. Being canceled in a paradoxical way is proof of an excess of caring, but in a bad way. No one wants to be on the receiving end of that much caring, but it is caring. It's just the stupidest kind of caring imaginable. Let me wrap up with this thought experiment, suitable for folks on both sides of the color line. Chadwick Boseman, the star of the Black Panther, one of the highest earning movies in history, died last year after a secret struggle with colon cancer. Everyone was in shock and mourning. He was popular with critics, audiences, and his fellow celebrities. He was also the star of a multi-billion-dollar franchise that would now have to go on without him. What should Marvel, Disney do with a Chadwick Boseman-sized hole to fill? Should the studio recast the role of T'Challa, the Black Panther, with another talented African-American actor who would bring his own spin to the character? Or should Marvel Disney kill the beloved character off because it would be impossible to make audiences forget Chadwick Boseman? Those who believe Black folks are hothouse flowers incapable of accepting the death of a beloved actor without taking it out on a successor push for killing off the most impressive Black superhero in Marvel's cinematic canon. Killing the character instead of recasting him and continuing the inspiration is a billion-dollar concession to sentimentality and white liberal condescension at its worst. Now, imagine Chadwick Boseman was still alive, but had made some unfortunate utterance about, say, Barack Obama, using the N-word in a nasty and non-affectionate way. All things being equal in terms of the money the film he starred in made, Marvel Disney would have fired him without blinking an eye and recast him for the sequels. Why? Because this is a billion-dollar franchise. That's why. You see what they did with The Mandalorian. There was a woman who said some unfortunate things, and they bounced her fast. If Chadwick Boseman had been fired, I would have written a column saying, give Chadwick Boseman another chance. But I wouldn't have lost much sleep over it, just as long as this great franchise continued. Marvel Disney's decision to kill the character is completely illogical, and I believe motivated by fear and lack of understanding of its vast Black audience. Disney doesn't want to be on the wrong side of Black Twitter or Black social media giants. It is afraid of treating Black audiences the same way a sane studio would treat fans of James Bond movies. In the real world, including Black audiences, there is a tacit understanding that if a beloved actor unexpectedly dies, the show must go on. God forbid that Lin-Manuel Miranda had died during the height of Hamilton mania. But if he had, his understudy would have taken over. It would have added poignance to those post-Miranda performances, but no one would have dreamed of killing off the Hamilton character in tribute. So why kill the Black Panther? Fear of Black folks being mad about continuing on without Chadwick Boseman, pure and simple. This is the kind of cancel culture that really gets on my nerve, not that silly stuff that we normally talk about. If you want to be a good Black friend, send Disney Marvel an email imploring them not to kill the best Black Hollywood superhero of all time. Their condescension is nothing short of racism personified. So I'm very glad I got that off my chest. Now, if you have any questions, let's roll. Hello?
Hey, Tony.
Hey.
This is Steve. I'm back. Let me get my video back up here.
Okay.
My ticket. There we go. We do have a couple of questions here, Tony. Thanks so much for that. And I want to remind people to send your questions to Tony via chat, and we'll get them up here. Question number one, Tony. We'll launch right into this. I'm going to quote here. I found folks are very uncomfortable using the term white supremacy in spaces that are majority white and moderate. Can you define the term? What are the reasons, or can you define the term? Are there reasons to push using the term white supremacy rather than racism or even the more comfortable prejudice bias?
Well, I think that white supremacy works for me and for a lot of other folks because I think it's appropriate for the bigness of what we're talking about. We're talking about an ideology that has been at the basis of American commerce and history from the very beginning. It was the ideology that justified slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. And it's a trickle-down philosophy that has come through history and colored every institution that we have. If you say bias or racism, that's sort of picayune. I mean, it's so small. Everyone has some biases. Everyone has some racial prejudices because the superstructure of our country is white supremacy. It was not like fill in the blank supremacy, it was white supremacy. And when you think about it, people my age were born second-class citizens until the Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts in the mid-60s. I don't know what you would call a system that would countenance the second-class citizenship of millions of people through 400 years. There are lots of people who are uncomfortable with that term, but there were more people who are uncomfortable with being slaves or being, shunted off their land and exterminated. I think folks can deal with the marginal discomfort of acknowledging a system for what it is.
Okay, Tony, here's another one. What's the difference between what was decried as PC culture of the 90s and 2000s and the cancel culture that we have that's decried today?
Not much, except the absence of social media, at least in the 90s. I think that what happened in the 90s would have been, exactly what happened. The 90s with social media would have been the 2020s. So I'm sure that there are all sorts of individual distinctions that, and probably obvious distinctions I'm not thinking of, but they are at root the same thing. Except now, cancel culture has the ability to cause people to lose their jobs in a way that the 90s PC culture didn't. At root, I mean, even terms like cancel culture and PC, I mean, they defy a certain political bias, which I don't accept. They're rooted in sort of like a right-wing contempt for egalitarianism and equality. And so I'm always suspicious of those terms, but I'm just using it because it's in the air right now. But I think that a more thoughtful discussion is what it always is. What are the origins and the roots of this contempt? And it's clear, it's white supremacy or whatever. If someone comes up with a good alternative to that, I'll be glad to use it. I mean, I'm not hung up on using white supremacy, except it's the most accurate term right now. But if someone can come up with a better term that splits the baby between being, offensive to those who don't want to use it, but still want to be accurate, I would use it.
Okay, Tony, we have a question here from Jason. Esau McCaulley, in his book, Reading While Black, African-American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. For example, he suggests that God's kingdom as being multi-ethnic is not just nice, but essential. How else might a Christian worldview help create an environment where white people can be allies and Black people good friends?
It's what I said. It isn't easy being a friend, period. And Christians definitely fail at that as much as anyone. I don't think there's anything unique about a Christian identity, unfortunately, when it comes to pursuing the kingdom of God. I mean, we've had 400 years of pursuing the kingdom of God in America, and I think we get every year we get an inch closer to hell. So I understand what he's asking in terms of trying to come up with a coherent Christian response to the brokenness of this world. But it seems to me that instead of asking for a uniquely Christian way of bringing about the kingdom, let's see if we can have a uniquely human way of tolerating each other and actually deepening our friendships, not based upon any sort of creedal agreement or religious worldview, but just the sort of the existential reality of the fact that we're both human beings on this planet, in this country, trying to find our way to a better space, to a better space of mutual understanding. I mean, the folks who were doing all the whipping, for hundreds of years in this country were Christians. The folks who codified the US Constitution, they were free thinkers, they were Christians, they were non-Christians, they were whatever. But, there hasn't been anything particularly distinctive about the Christian identity in this country. In the 1950s, Christians believed in segregation as much as non-Christians. So, I mean, I hate to bust a bubble there, but I don't know. I'm not particularly hopeful that Christians will come up with a particularly unique pathway to, and I'm a Christian. I think other than the civil rights movement, which, let's face it, white denominations looked down upon and denounced Dr. Martin Luther King when he was alive. Oh, they hated him. They hated him. As soon as he gets assassinated, he's a saint. So, we got to be a little bit real here and understand that, in many ways, there's a lot of Pollyannish Christian theology and revisionism when it comes to racial reconciliation, because we just haven't seen enough of it to take it seriously yet. I may be wrong, and there might be a revolution in Christian circles today that I'm not aware of. I think that it's individual churches, like what you guys are doing, Steve, and what's happening, at churches I attend. There really is, like, on a individual congregational level, a commitment to this. And even denominations will have statements about the need for anti-racist practice. But in a way, they're all sort of Johnny-come-latelys, and where were they for, hundreds of years? So that's the problem. We just have to figure out a way to achieve this mutual understanding, regardless of creedal confession, and acknowledge our humanness and our brokenness, and move towards a friendship that transcends everything else.
Thanks, Tony. Hey, we got a question here from Amy. This past week, Joe Biden said, in light of the Asian American killings, that racism against Asian Americans is un-American.
Yes.
And John Oliver argued that being racist is American, given our history.
It's six of one and a half dozen of the other. I mean, John Oliver was just being, very clever. Yeah, he's right. It's a very American thing. Now, Joe Biden is talking in an aspirational way. So, you just sort of give him that, In reality, he knows that the world is racist, that America is racist. He understands that, or else he wouldn't have assembled the kind of cabinet that he did. He wouldn't have chosen a vice president that he did. He understands that, he was operating in a deficit understanding of the world, and that he needed to be brought up to speed. John Oliver is absolutely right. There's nothing more American than racism. And that's where we are. That's why I kept harping on white supremacy. That is, would we be occupying this country the way we are, would we have filled this country the way we have if there hadn't been the assumption that the folks who were already here, well, whatever claim that they had to it, it can be pushed aside, and we can fill the land, and we can even kill them. Is that possible without white supremacy, or was it just some misunderstanding? It's like you gotta face the reality of what and who we are, or else we'll be stuck on this hamster wheel of self-delusion and lies, and we'll just oppress another generation of people. John Oliver is right. But I appreciate Joe Biden's aspiration. But when he says that, that's un-American, he's technically and spiritually and historically wrong. But his patriotism, I appreciate that, but it's Pollyannish.
Well, what do you think, Tony? What would happen if a U.S. president admitted, as John Oliver did, that racism is American and that it needs to change? And do you think Joe Biden or a president should say that?
I think he actually has said that, maybe not in the ways, that clearly, but I'm under the impression that he is hip to that. And of course, in the past, there have been apologies for slavery, but there have never, like by Bill Clinton, but there's never been sort of like a systemic attempt to roll back the pernicious effects of slavery. And that's disappointing. But if Joe Biden is able to put into action, a series of policies or legislation, sign legislation that begins to roll back these things, that would be a good start. It's not going to happen in one administration. It's not going to happen in one generation. It's going to be a multi-generational effort, because we didn't get here in 4 years. Donald Trump, for as awful as he was just a continuation of a certain worldview. He just sort of took advantage of, the terrible politics that were already in place for, centuries, except he made them even more obnoxious because he didn't try to hide his racism.
Tony, I got a question here for John. Which form of racism is more damaging, covert or overt?
That's almost like asking which one of your twin boys is ugliest. It's like the one that hurts the most is the overt, because that's out in the open, and you have to deal with the existential horror of someone calling you the N-word and saying, no, you can't move into this apartment or this house because you're Black or whatever. That's more troubling to you because you have no room to rationalize it. That overt racism. The covert stuff, where people smile in your face and say, oh, we've already rented out that house, sorry, you seem like a good person, would have been great to have you as a tenant, but we already rented out that place. That is just as destructive, but it's just that you don't know you've been kicked in the butt. And so, 6 of one and half dozen of the other, right? People seem to prefer the overt racism because at least there's no ambiguity. But but it plays on, it still eats at your psyche. In many ways, because you're a human being, you don't want to think about all of that rejection, and you kind of wish someone would be subtle. It's like Trump would have won a second term if he was subtle in his racism, if he was subtle in all the destructive things he did, if he just was your typical Republican and just sort of like used euphemisms and dog whistles and so forth. Man, there never would have been a storming of the Capitol. He would have won re-election, in a song, but he could not deny his fundamental nature, which is racist and obnoxious and overt. So I guess if I had to choose, I would choose the covert kind, even though it might get me in more trouble.
Thanks, Tony. We have a question here from Diana. Do you foresee a future when Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, and LGBTQ people can merge into a large force to make American change its basic foundations?
Oh, yeah. And I think that's inevitable. I think that will happen. Is it going to happen in 2024? No. Is it going to happen, in this decade? You're going to see the beginnings of that. It's just demographics. The folks who compose the bulk of the Republican coalition are old and they're going to die. And their children, many of them are just as prejudiced as they are, but they're not going to be organized in a way that can stop the inevitable. We're going to be a majority country in the 2040s. And I can't see, unless the Constitution were changed and voting were restricted to those who can guess how many jelly beans are in a jar. And unless something really amazing like that happens, I think this coalition is inevitable, because I think that things are going to get worse, which is going to stimulate a reformist movement. And the formation of coalitions. I think that that's inevitable. And I think that's why the Republican Party is freaking out right now, because they can see that. And so it's all about forestalling that, redrawing districts so that gerrymandering so that it favors, the most reactionary people, in a particular area. That's going to continue for a while, but it's at some point, you run out of soldiers because everyone is dead or in the old folks home. So yeah, I see that coalition coming together.
All right, Tony, we got a question here from Michael, who's obviously paying attention to your background imagery there, and this changes the direction very briefly, but what's your favorite Dylan album?
Oh, easy. Blonde on Blonde. My favorite Dylan song is Visions of Johanna. So yeah, I did a movie in college where I illegally used a whole bunch of songs from Blonde on Blonde to create the mood in the piece. And it's still one of the favorite things I've ever done. So yeah, Blonde on Blonde is my favorite album. Visions of Johanna is my favorite Dylan song.
Okay, here's a question from Eric. How do I spend more time in Black spaces within my city to participate and interact with all communities without seeming like I'm imposing myself or trying to take over that said community? I live in Minneapolis, and when I spend time in traditionally Black parts of the city, I feel the justified mistrust of said community.
Oh, well, I don't know what it's like in Minneapolis, but what I would suggest, and I mean this, is like risk being misunderstood. Just show up with your laptop and just sit and write, if it's a coffee shop or whatever, and sooner or later you're going to strike up a conversation with someone, and it's going to be genuine, and you're going to be fine and they're going to be fine, and then before you know it, you're just one of the gang. See, I'm a big believer in very informal networking, without making a big deal of things. Just be the change you want to be. If you want to have Black friends, just be a Black friend. You don't have to announce it. It doesn't have to be a program. It doesn't have to be anything. You just need to just sort of like show up in those spaces. And it's going to be some arched eyebrows at first. And that's because, Black folks are suffering from white supremacy too, and suspicion. The politics of suspicion is what this country has always been about. It's like you just have to be a circuit breaker and decide that, what? Screw all the suspicion. I'm just going to go there, and people might even laugh at me. But sooner or later, they're going to say, hey, you come here a lot, man. What's your story? And that will be eureka.
Question here from Tom. Is it difficult to see the reemergence of Malcolm X's point of view 60 years later?
Is it difficult? No. I mean, Malcolm, if you ask me whose philosophy I'm closer to, Malcolm X or MLK, I would say MLK, but I wouldn't see them as antagonistic. I mean, Malcolm X, became a more Pan-African and more broadly speaking Muslim in a non-racial identity way towards the end of his life. He rejected a lot of his earlier white separatist pronouncements to embrace a race-neutral Islam. I'm one of those weird folks who believes that Christianity and Islam and every religion can have a respectful dialogue, and even invite non-believers, or atheists, to be a part of that, because I think that yeah, I'm a universalist. At the end, you think God gives, blank about what denomination you are. I mean, that's insane. And so I think that both King and Malcolm X and all the great leaders of the 60s who were assassinated, be they Christian or non-Christian or whatever, if you believe in God, then God is giving props to all of them. He's not saying, I don't like this, you were selling bean pies and you used to follow Elijah Muhammad. Nope, you're not welcome. I think that's silly. And so when you ask, am I disappointed in what? If Malcolm X hadn't scared the hell out of white people, we wouldn't have gotten as far as we got. So that was great.
We have a question here from Louise. Can you comment about the inconsistency between banning some books, Huckleberry Finn, for example, but rap lyrics still including lyrics like Cardi B, who still use some of the same language? How do you justify it? I'm trying to read this question here without repeating some of the language in the question.
I think I know what she means. Well, first of all, I would not justify the banning of Huckleberry Finn. The very first article I ever wrote for the Post-Gazette when I was a freelancer, before I was even on staff, was in defense of the teaching of Huckleberry Finn. A Black parent in Virginia had petitioned to have the book removed from circulation. She didn't want her son to read Huckleberry Finn. And so in January or February of 1988, my very first published piece in a newspaper was about how ridiculous this was, and that this was a parent who didn't understand the revolutionary power of Huck Finn and what Mark Twain was attempting to do. It was just basically a parent who had never read the book, but who took objection to the fact that the N-word appears, 200 odd times in it, or whatever it was, 300. Cardi B is an entertainer, and her music is enormously liberating for a lot of women. It's not my cup of tea, but I certainly understand its value. The fact that she uses Cardi B's music is just not for everyone. It's not for older folks who are offended by it, quite frankly. Just as, Marvin Gaye's, music wasn't for the white folks who didn't like it, or blues music, race music, which was banned in many parts of America. They just had old bluesmen singing on it. Was an enormous scandal for white folks. In fact, there has never been a genre of Black music that didn't piss off a lot of white folks who don't get it, and was like, well, why should you be able to use the N-word, in rap, and I can't use it? Well, if you go use it, use the N-word and see what it gets you. It's a ridiculous sort of objection. It's like, well, some things aren't fair. Slavery wasn't fair. And whenever I bring up slavery, people say, get over it. So whenever they bring up rap, I say, get over it.
Okay, Tony, this is from Maria. The Republicans certainly seem to be attacking voting rights. Is that a real threat or hyped?
Oh, that's a real threat. That's a real threat. That is the great existential. You dogs, be quiet. Hey. Oh, I'm sorry. It is the great existential threat to American democracy, even more so than the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. Georgia, which everyone praised Georgia, for electing the two, senators, Democratic senators. And remember praising the Republican attorney general and the governor and so forth, because they did not back down or give in to Trump. Well, and they said that, hey, this was the freest election in Georgia ever. You know, there was no funny business, and this president was trying to coerce us. Yes, they deserved praise for standing up to the president. Those same people are now colluding to take away voting rights for Black folks and for non-Republicans. It's insidious. And so, because they know Stacey Abrams is going to run for governor, and they don't want to see Black folks, Black voters change the politics of Georgia. And so they're pulling out all the stops, and that's happening all over the country. So it is insidious, and it is the biggest threat to American democracy since the old Jim Crow. It's basically Jim Crow dressed up.
Okay, Tony. We got two questions here about reparations. Let me ask them both, and you can hit them one after the other. Do you think that reparations would help move the country away from white supremacy? That's the first one. And the second one, can we dismantle white supremacy ever without reparations? Do you agree with Heather McGhee's premise that white people see equity as a zero-sum game?
See this book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. I would say if you're going to read any book this year, read this book. This is the clearest distillation of the of just how the clearest explanation of how messed up America is and how it got this way that I think I've ever read, bar none. And she uses as her metaphor the swimming pools. Remember, America went on a swimming pool building, binge in the 1950s, the 40s and the 50s. And there were just sort of thousands of Olympic swimming pools built up all over the country. They were segregated, but America loved its swimming pools. And it was like, yeah, this is like, we have found nirvana. This is post-war. We go to these great places and it's just us, white folks. Well, suddenly Black folks started winning lawsuits to desegregate and open up pools. I mean, here in Pittsburgh, the Highland Park pool had to be desegregated. Folks did not like this. White folks started filling the pools in rather than share it with Black people. Or if they didn't fill it in, they would designate particular days for Black people to swim. And when those days were over, like they would get 1 day out of 7. When those days were over, they would drain the pool, drain the water out of the pool rather than share the pool with Black folks. And this happened, and then when it was just sort of like obvious that Black folks were just going to keep winning lawsuits, desegregating pools all over the country, what happened? A lot of white folks decided that, you know what? I'm just going to build a pool in my backyard. I don't have the money for it, but my kids like swimming, and I just don't want them interacting with those people. And so you saw the boom in backyard pools. Meanwhile, the municipal pools started falling to disrepair, and they weren't usable anyway after a few years. And the next thing you know, you have these great pools that are just cracked, their foundations are like cracking, and you have like generations of Black kids who don't learn how to swim. And Heather McGhee uses that as a metaphor for what America is, that folks would rather do without, even if it hurts them, just so they don't share the pool, just so they don't share healthcare, just so they don't share tax revenues, just so they don't share fill in the blank, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. It was like folks would rather just do without than to see the extension, you know, of the franchise or opportunities to everyone. And that, I don't know what you would call that if not white supremacy. It's self-defeating. It has cost our economy trillions of dollars because it has idled people who were otherwise productive. It meant that, you know, Black folks who had saved their money and scuffed and so forth to make it into the middle class couldn't move their family into, you know, white neighborhoods that had all the great schools because there was an unwillingness to share. No, you stay in your neighborhood and let your tax base take care of your schools. What? A lot of poor people in your community and you can't like maintain quality schools? Too bad. This is America. Deal with it, right? I mean, that's the attitude. That's still the attitude today. And Heather McGhee and the Sum of Us she's not sentimental. She just says, okay, here are the facts, here are the numbers, here's the reality, deal with it. And and what was the other question about reparations?
Yeah. Can we dismantle white supremacy ever without reparations?
Well, I think the term reparations has become like a boogeyman. I prefer the term, you know, equality. I think that's less intimidating to people, and I think there's less of, you know, this sort of fraught debate about equality. Wouldn't it be nice if we could approach, you know, like the American social contract in an equitable fashion? Instead of coming up with clever ways to exclude people, what would happen if we were suddenly committed to, I don't know, you know, like making sure that all schools were funded, you know, in an equitable fashion, that your school system was not predicated upon your tax base? What would America be like if there were really good resources in urban schools, really good teachers in urban schools? What would America be like? It would be completely different. It would be transformed. What would it be like if, I don't know, you didn't have high Black infant mortality in a city like Pittsburgh that has first-class medical centers? What would that be like? I think that would be reparations. That would be this sort of social and financial equality that would make a difference in society. We're in a zero-sum game situation because we've bought into this myth that for every dollar that goes into the community to help the other means that that's dollars coming out of white people's pockets. And there are people who are, you know, who seem perfectly rational and say, oh yeah, you know, that's socialism and da-da-da-da-da. You know, and they believe it. But that's a reflection of the white supremacist presuppositions that have been a part of the mentality of Americans since the beginning. You know, imagine the audacity of coming to this shore, coming to America, seeing people there, killing them, and then telling stories about them, about how inferior they were. And not having your head explode from the cognitive dissonance. I mean, that's a trick. I mean, that is just, you know, and to use religion to baptize that, you know, but no one's fooled. People are just self-deluded, and they don't hold themselves responsible for being double-minded. And when it's pointed out to them, their feelings are hurt. I don't care.
We have a question here from Carlin. As a former computer science teacher, the book Stuck in the Shallow End uses the history of segregated pools to illustrate the current technological gap. How do we work towards narrowing that gap? I know you've already shared some of this in terms of funding. Are there other significant changes that are needed?
Yeah, I think there needs to be, in many ways, a Marshall Plan for the inner cities. There needs to be a serious, let's play catch up by going into the inner cities with, you know, with schools and technology that are first rate. Creating tax policies that encourage innovation within these communities. Breaking down the artificial barrier of representation. The fact is that, you know, you have lots of institutions that pat themselves on the back because they got one or two, you know, people of color or women or whatever in some senior management role, and everyone else looks like they always did. And you don't have creative thinking when you have like a stagnant pool. The same people who sort of like countenance this equilibrium for centuries are still in control, and there's no fresh thinking. So I used to have a lot of hope for the technologies. I used to believe that, you know, the people who will save us will be Silicon Valley and so forth. But that hasn't proven to be true. I mean, you know, when it turns out that some forms of AI are just downright racist, you know, it's like we're almost perpetuating the same old assumptions, even in these new sectors, even in the tech sector. So, but I think that if the government were to, through several enlightened administrations, take it upon themselves to just sort of like, okay, we know the schools are inferior. We know that the people, the kids here, you know, if given a chance, could perform as well as any kids in the country. They just don't have the chance. They just don't have the resources. We know that even from the days of segregated schools, you know, there were some superior segregated schools because there were superior teachers teaching them. So we know that there isn't anything particularly intrinsic about being, you know, Black and uneducated. It's the resources. And right now we don't have the will to fund schools, let's say, or we don't have the will to fund babies in utero in the Black community, to make sure their parents, their mothers, you know, get nutrition, you know, get proper nutrition. There are food deserts all over Pittsburgh. There are food deserts everywhere. And then what food you do find is junk food. I mean, to me, if I were paranoid, I would say this looks like genocide. You know, why do we allow the status quo to be so awful for so many people? Capitalism. All right. You know, that's the devil you worship. Okay. But let's not call the devil an angel.
Tony, you've been very generous with your time tonight. We've taken 90 minutes of it. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, no, this has been fun. I hope I didn't drone on too much. How many thousands of people did we lose while I was droning on?
But actually, I've been reading through the chat list here, and a lot of people are saying thanks, Tony. It's been a moving presentation. So you're getting a lot of thumbs up. You have any final thoughts you want to leave us with here?
Oh man. Well, first of all, I just really appreciate what you folks there at the community church of Ben Avon are doing. And and you could have very easily just had another sort of book group or something like that. But I think this is much more relevant, to sort of have different people come in and talk about what they think and so forth. I mean, this is a rare opportunity. I don't usually get a chance to rant like this. And so I appreciate it. And just sort of putting this together, it's forced me to think about things in fresh new ways. And I hope that people accept it in the spirit in which it is meant. Again, so my best friends are white, as you know. Steve, you're one of my best friends. My wife has some thoughts about that. It's so what I say is it really does come out of a spirit of what I hope would be, critical love. And I think that America is a very complicated place. We just got to recognize it for what it is, and we have to struggle against that and understand that it's not gonna be easy, but we have to begin to call things what they are. We have to begin to name the devil so that he will flee from us. And if we're not capable of doing that, we're just gonna be stuck in hell. And I don't like hell. I don't like hell. I don't like being stuck in hell. And so hopefully this will be a ladder to me and to other people.
Well, Tony, you hold a special place in my heart. So thanks again for everybody involved here. And I think, Laura, were you going to close us out here with a word?
Yeah. So hello, everyone. I'm Laura Bentley. I'm on staff at Community Church, and just want to thank everyone who joined us tonight for taking the time to be on this, for the thoughtfulness of the questions. And Tony, thank you so much for your time and your insights and your candidness in answering a ton of questions at the end of this. So I just wanted to do a couple quick reminders. The first is that this video, it's all been recorded tonight. It's going to be posted on the church's website, which is CPCBA.org. You can Google us too, probably be an easier way to get there. So you can watch this later on if you missed any or want to share it with folks. And we will have next month's speaker is Tim Stevens. He's going to be on here Thursday, April 22nd at 7. So put that in your calendars, look for an email about it. We'll be posting on social media, things like that as well. So I just was going to close us out with a very brief blessing, which is from our Presbyterian Common Book of Worship. And yeah, we'll say this prayer and be on our way tonight. May the God of justice lead us through the tumultuous sea, and I would add, and our own stumbles. May the Christ who came to dwell among us renew the strength of our dreams. May the Holy Spirit guide us to still waters where justice, solidarity, and peace reign. Amen.
Amen.